the next edition of the lecture in the workshop series. Since I contacted him last, Dr. Uday has moved continents. He's gone from Delhi and he's now in Nantes Institute of Advanced Study in Paris. And I'm so glad that you agreed to reschedule it and be with us despite your hectic travel and settling down. I'm so happy. Warm welcome to you to the session. The moderator for today is our PhD scholar, Aparna. She's working rethinking the regional identity of culture and politics in pre-modern Kerala. Over to you, Aparna, to moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening to all and warm welcome to the lecture of the International Online Workshop conducted by the Department of History, Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, in association with Kerala Council for Historical Research. I am Abanna MP, research scholar at this department. The running theme of the webinar is Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches. Before we begin, here are a few instructions to be noted. I request all to mute your audio and turn off video until the session is over. You may mark your attendance in the Google form. The link will be provided in the chat box shortly. You can also type your questions in the chat box during or at the end of the lecture. I will bring them up once the presentation is over. I hope you are clear with all the instructions. So, without further delay, let's begin the session. Today, we have with us our distinguished scholar, Dr. Udaya Kumar, currently working as a professor at the Nantes Institute of Advanced Study, France. He is talking on self-writing, narrations, and senses of the past. I invite Abhijit, MPhil student, Department of History, Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, to introduce Honorable Resource Person and welcome the gathering.
Good evening, all. Today is the 11th lecture of the International Workshop on Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches, jointly organized by Department of History, Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, and Kerala Council for Historical Research. We have eminent scholar Dr. Udaya Kumar today, who is currently a fellow at the Nantes Institute of Advanced Studies, France. He taught at Pune, Delhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru University. He did DPhil from University of Oxford on the title Repetition, Time and Structure in James Joyce's Ulysses, and MPhil from JNU. He was fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies at the Rashtrapati Niwas, Shimla, senior fellow of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and a Leverhulme visiting professor, School of English, Newcastle University, UK. Formerly a member of the editorial advisory board of Routledge Online Encyclopedia of Modernism and member of Leverhulme Research Network in Post-Colonial Translation. He is the author of the books Writing First-Person Literature, History and Autobiography in Modern Kerala and the Joycean Liberian Repetition, Time and Tradition in Ulysses. In first one, he traces the emergence of a discourse on modern self-articulation in Malayalam language by examining a variety of forms of writing from late 19th and early 20th century, a period of major social transformation in Kerala. The second book examines the relation between the textual organization of Ulysses and the notions of time, language, and poetics implicated in the James Joyce's novel. He is currently doing projects named History, Identity and Spatiality, Vernacular Social Thought in Early 20th Century Kerala, and Spaces, Structures, Objects, a collection of essays on late 20th century Malayalam fiction. Besides, he has also published numerous papers on modern literature and culture, especially in Kerala. He is one of the eminent scholars to be listed in the Directory of Contemporary Authors, Volume 142. I welcome the distinguished speaker of the day, Professor Udaya Kumar, to deliver the lecture on self-writing, narration, and sense of the past, and also welcome all the participants to the lecture and activities to be participated in the session. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. Now I invite Dr. Udaya Kumar to make his presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Aparna. Thank you, Abhijit, and thank you, Shiba and other colleagues in Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit. Sorry, it's wonderful to come back to Sri Sankaracharya University where I have so many friends and long association. But I'm also a little, how should I say, nervous because I said she was name wrong partly because of that. I think because I feel like I am walking blindfolded in a room. I can't see anybody. So that of course changes your feel, and maybe it's a sign of the changing experience of publicness in our times. I'll have a little bit to speak about that towards the end of this talk, hopefully. But I also suffer from another anxiety when I'm here. Uh, that's really because I'm not a historian by training or by profession, but somebody who has learned from historians. I work on literature, and of course, working on literature inevitably takes you to questions of history. Literature is a form of thought, and as a form of thought, it has a history, which of course demands a historical sense and the establishment of linkages with other terrains of history. But at the same time, working on literature also involves a kind of resistance to uh, dominant ways of doing history or the most cherished practices of disciplinary history. Now, what I mean by this is that there can be a historical approach to literature which takes literature as the object of a historical study, like the way in which we can have other objects for historical study, be it the workers' movement, or be it the history of a certain attitude, or the history of a certain object or a commodity. But there is a different sense, a somewhat different sense in which we can think about the relationship between literature and history, where literature appears as a certain mode of experiencing and articulating one's historical existence. In other words, literary productions themselves may be seen as a way of marking history, a way of manifesting history, and also a way of inscribing history. Of course, they do not do it in the professional, disciplinary sense of history, but they do it in a distinctive way which demands a different set of tools for understanding, for analysis, etc., etc. In this sense, the kind of literary texts that I have looked at in relationship to the question of history, they belong to a domain which now we call the vernacular, not because it belongs to a non-cosmopolitan language or a regional language, but because it does not adopt the disciplinary mode of professional historiography. It has a relationship to that domain, but it also stays away from that domain. So these questions are interesting in the context of this webinar series, I hope, for thinking about what kind of archive is constituted by literature, or what different archives may arise if we look at literature in these two different kinds of relationship with historical investigation. Now, the problem or the situation is rendered more complex by the genres that we call life writing, because life writing genres, be they biography or autobiography, or several other forms of life writing, they stand somewhere between literature and history, or they have elements of both of them. Because these texts seek to recount the lives of oneself or others, and in that sense, they propose or they make certain truth claims which we see as closer to that of historical discourse. But at the same time, they also offer what is often somewhat crudely called as subjective, fictional, or imaginary responses to historical events. So life writing in that sense is difficult to classify in this divide between historical discourses and literary discourses, because they stand somewhere in between, drawing on both and belonging to both. Now, another important thing to remember about these modes of life writing or life narration, let's say, because before writing, of course, life narration existed orally and they still exist. Life narration, in that sense, retains probably one of the fundamental structures of historical transmission because we know that our conception of history and a historical past as different from a personal past is based on a differentiation between what you may call the continuity of a community or the continuity of society on the one hand and the finitude of each generation on the other. So, uh, historical knowledge is an attempt to overcome the limits of generational finitude. And you could say that life narration is probably one of the elementary modes through which or in which this impulse manifested itself. And now there is some recent work which makes us rethink this question of the continuity of community, where Dipesh Chakrabarty, for instance, in his work on the Anthropocene, suggested that if the species history itself comes to be seen as finite, then what happens to historical knowledge? But that's a different question. I merely wanted to signpost that. Now, when I speak about life narration, of course, narration is the key concept there. Storytelling is the main mode which is used. And narration, as we know, is one of the dominant modes of historical writing as well. Now, life writing in that sense is a kind of narration of historical events as experienced by a person, sometimes by a person who did not live the life that he or she is speaking about, but who has collected kinds of evidence which sometimes go beyond what a historian may consider as legitimate evidence. And in this sense, it also possesses a kind of tension with procedures of veridiction, which are there in disciplinary historiography. Because we know that the concept of the archive, in its more traditional sense, is really about the use of traces that are displaced from their context of original intent and original use. Like the records, the official records we consult, they were not generated to be consulted by us. They were generated for carrying out various kinds of activities of governance, administration, decision making, etc., etc. And similarly, other kinds of records, be they related to trade, be they related to life activities, they also were not really intended to be read by scholars of history and intended to be traces on which a historical knowledge would be built in the future. Now, in the case of life narration, of course, this is not the case. There is an intention to tell the story of a life. And in that sense, there is a certain perspective, there is a conscious project which is at issue there. And this itself has created some attitude of caution or suspicion in the modern skeptical epistemology which characterizes modern human sciences as to how true or dependable life narratives can be assumed as. Now, we know that the genres of self-narration or life narration, like autobiography, for instance, are usually aligned with the emergence of the modern individual. In India, like in many other parts of the world, these genres become current from the 19th century onwards. But we also know that many of these forms have a longer history. Like in the Western tradition, people often speak about St. Augustine's Confessions, the Stoic writings on the self, the biographical tradition in the Roman antiquity. In the context of India, once again, we have a variety of forms which actually record lives. even one's own life, like in the case of Arthakathanak, or if we want to expand the domain of tradition, then Baburnama. There are several texts of that kind. Now, how do we understand then the relationship between the individual and this activity of self-narration? Here, I think it would be very useful to shift our attention away from what is being represented. In other words, shift our attention away from a framework of representation to look at what kind of practices self-narratives and life narratives were actually inserted in. We know that biographies become very important in the context of practices which are pedagogic, practices which are commemorative, and practices which are aimed at cultivating cultivating and encouraging certain acts of emulation. Now, hagiographical accounts are of this kind, and even in modern times, the modern biographical tradition, quite a lot of it is aimed at or motivated by this pedagogic impulse. I am sure that most of us may have encountered biographical writing and autobiographical writing first in our school textbooks, be it by Gandhi or by Nehru or biographical writings about famous figures from India and other parts of the world. There is an attempt at inculcating a certain impulse of moral emulation, you could say, and a certain pedagogy of values, which is at the heart of this. Now, we know that in the context of personal narration by oneself, that what we call the autobiographical tradition, once again, the beginnings are to be found in or in contexts which are very clearly related to practices. Like in the context of Malayalam, we know that what has been identified as one of the earliest modern autobiographies is a conversion narrative by somebody called Jacob Ramavarman, written in the context of his conversion, in the context of his confirmation as a preacher by the Basel Mission. Yeah? Now, Protestant Christianity brought in a particular set of templates for articulating this moment of conversion and narrating the events in one's life with a view to generating a certain kind of attentiveness and a certain kind of listening within the religious community. Now, I didn't want to go into a long discussion of Ramavarman's narrative, but what is interesting in this is that even though the narrative actually recounts the events that lead to his conversion, the crucial event which is spoken about, the most decisive event, is a kind of moment when the speaking subject and the remembering subject is out of control, where you manifest a certain kind of emotional excess which makes you defy your own decisions, your own conscious control, and declare a certain surrender before a kind of command, an internal command, which is also an external command, which you cannot disobey. In other words, it's a kind of moment of convulsion, which actually does not allow itself to be understood in terms of conscious intentionality, agency, that marks the decisive moment that is recounted in this personal narrative. Now, this feature you will find in a different way in some of the really early autobiographies written in what may be called loosely in a kind of non-secular context, like Vaikettu Pachimotha's autobiography once again has this impulse of recording a kind of miraculous healing of one's illness when one was suffering from smallpox. But Pachimotha and Jacob Ramavarman offer two different kinds of templates for writing the self. In Muttada, this miraculous event does not really lead to a change in the speaker's relationship to his life activities or the way in which he sees the world, Whereas in Ramavarman, it seems to alter everything and create a kind of decisive distinction between what happened before, how one existed before, and what happens later. Now, what I meant to suggest by invoking these examples is the centrality of practices related to selfhood, practices related to narration, which are really at the heart of what we consider as life writing texts. So, looking at them through the framework of what figures are represented may not fully enable us to understand the way in which they bear witness to a historical moment or manifest their historicality. Now, in India, uh, in many languages, including Malayalam, a lot of the autobiographies written in the 19th century and a predominant part of the 20th century, especially the first half of the 20th century, were written with a kind of conscious amateur historical intent. What I mean by this is uh, the authors often say that what motivated them to write their autobiographies is not so much the desire to tell the story of their lives, but to speak about the changing times. Now, this can take the form of the narration of events of historical significance, people who live through momentous events. And sometimes the authors may be participants or leaders in this sequence of events. But sometimes they themselves may actually not be active in these events, but they may be a kind of witness figures, so to say, to these events. So there is an attempt to tell the story of these events. That is one kind of autobiographical writing with a historical intent. But there are other kinds as well. There are authors who have written their autobiographies to speak about the changing social practices. They feel that social practices in Kerala have changed during the period of their lifetime. So the Kerala that existed when they were children are no longer in the memory of the new generation. So there is a need to kind of preserve it, represent it. So there is a kind of ethnographic element, an ethnography of the past where you recall practices with a certain density of detail and try to recreate a world that they think has disappeared or seriously transformed. Now, so this is not so much about events, but about relationships, practices, rituals. Caste practices are absolutely an important element in many of these narratives. Uh, the, the world in which caste practices were maintained and how these practices have changed and the framework within which they were seen by the participants have changed, these become an important concern in many of these narratives. But apart from this recording of practices, which of course we can recount, we can recall, we can identify as practices and speak about consciously, many of these autobiographies also contain what you may call a level that is less conscious, a level of the past and ways of living in the past about which even the author may actually not be very conscious and articulate in his or her autobiography. Now, after Marcel Mauss and Pierre Bourdieu and many of the anthropological thinkers, we have come to call this a domain of habitus. Now, habitus is a set of imbibed norms. We are not naturally born with them, we learn them. But they have become so much part of us that they constitute a kind of unreflected terrain. But this unreflected terrain that appears natural to us is actually something that is clearly and decisively historical. Now, autobiographies which are written against a background of changing times, or which are written in a somewhat distant past, often bring up, not always intentionally, this domain of habitus. And I feel that that is a kind of dimension of the historical, which autobiographies and literary creations offer, which is quite different from that offered by historical documents. Now, in the some work which I have done on autobiographies, one concept which I try to develop to look at this dimension, look at this set of problems, is the concept of inhabitation. Now, we know that this concept really has become important in the study of practices of selfhood and identities in recent social and cultural theory. Now, what exactly do we mean by inhabitation? All of us, in some sense, when we engage in self-narration, we work with a certain framework of what you may call a normative conception of selfhood. Now, this is particularly visible to us when we are trying to change that normative frame in our own lives and trying to embrace something new, something which we see as more liberatory, more valuable. Now, when we look at autobiographies and biographies written during the reform period, the period of social reform, the emergence of these new normative frames is, of course, central, and it is visibilized. It can take the form of new religious convictions, new moralities, new ideas of masculinity and femininity, new conceptions of tradition, new ethics in behaving and conducting one's relationship with other people. There are many ways in which these new norms appear and the new normative universe appears. However, it's interesting that many of the autobiographies which actually overtly project these new normative frames also manifest or visualize moments when they are slipping away from them, when the narrative, without directly indenting it, manifests a moment of slippage, manifests a moment of what you may call inadequate inhabitation of the very normative frames that actually are foregrounded by the text. Now, in my book, which Abhijit mentioned in the introduction, right, in the first person, I have some discussion of certain autobiographical texts by Kani Payur and V.T. Patadiripada and C. Keshavan, which actually show or demonstrate these interesting moments where the autobiography shows something which doesn't quite fit within its framework, where its conscious project and what it actually shows are at some kind of mismatch. What I'm interested in particularly is that it is difficult to understand these moments of slippage and what appears through them in terms of the tools with which we analyze narratives. Because often they manifest themselves in a certain tone, a certain change in the texture of attention, the way in which details appear. There is a kind of affective charge which comes into the autobiographical narrative, which does not fully fit in with the narrative framework of continuity. Now, this affective dimension or these affective moments in some autobiographies deserves some special attention. So what I wish to talk about in the remaining part of this talk is mainly about this trend of looking at self-narratives and life narratives in general. Now, this can take the form of a manifestation of a certain kind of grief, which is not really validated by, or which is not accommodated by the narrative itself. Sometimes it can take the form of pleasures which are actually explicitly renounced or even denounced by the narrative. Sometimes it can take the form of difficult emotions like shame, embarrassment, which are very difficult to bring into narration itself. So, in such moments, or you could say that in this work of affective intensities which happen in life narration, there is a tension between them and the project of narration. That is the project of telling a story, consolidating a story, providing a framework of intelligibility to the events in one's life through the story. There is some kind of tension between the affective intensities, the domain of affective intensities, and this framework of narrative intelligibility. Now, here we also need to make one distinction. Now, I'm not suggesting that all manifestation or reference to emotion in autobiographies and biographies are of this kind. In fact, I'm speaking about those moments of affective charge which cannot be fully understood in terms of personal emotions. They cannot be really understood in terms of a framework of the integrity of the experiencing subject, integrity of the individual. They seem to be manifesting something which is larger or more intense, which cannot be owned by the subject, and therefore which cannot be narrated in the same way as one tends to narrate other events and emotions in one's personal past. I would even go so far as to suggest that in some narratives, an excessive personal emotion or a difficulty to manifest personal emotion in narrative may actually serve as a symptom which points to this larger domain of affective charge. So we know that these questions of affect in relationship to autobiographical narration in particular has become important in the study of self-narratives. We know that much of it has come up or happened under the sign of a study of testimonies, that is, witnessing accounts. Now, it's interesting that the word witness, many thinkers have pointed out that there are two different meanings to the word testis, from which the word testimony comes. One is that of a juridical witness. A juridical witness, we know, is somebody who is asked to provide an account as a third party to events he or she saw without being directly involved in them. That is, you may be involved in them, but the actual event on which you are commenting, the main parties of that, they are not the witnesses. It is a third party who is asked to offer witness accounts. But there is a different meaning to the word testis, which is the more dominant meaning, which appears in our study of testimonies, where the witness is a survivor. Somebody has lived through something difficult, something which put the person's integrity of subjectivity into danger, sometimes one's bodily integrity into danger as well. And having survived that, having lived through that, bearing the marks of that historical experience, you speak. And what you say even as it is about the events in your life, seems to offer a testimony to an event which is not contained by the limitations or within the territory of one's life. Now, the relationship between autobiographical narration or even biographical narration and the juridical frame, that of course goes back a very long time. In fact, in some cultures, the earliest life narratives that we find are from juridical accounts, where people defend themselves against accusations or provide a narrative account of the circumstances of an event where something in the nature of an event which contradicts the expectations of justice takes place. Even in modern times, we know that in the context of India, like in the context of Kerala, for instance, petitions can actually be a very important place where you find self-narratives coming up, where, when you're petitioning an authority which you think has a duty and the power to redress your grievance, you offer a certain narrative of your life or a part of your life in order to ground your demand and appeal to the power that your addressee has. Now, I mentioned the petition for a particular reason. I shall return to that towards the end of this talk. But at the moment, I'm talking much more about this survivor account, which characterizes the paradigm for thinking about testimonial narration. Now, the word survivor itself indicates that we are speaking about a sequence of events which actually puts life in danger. Just living through something or living something does not really constitute a survivor. A survivor is somebody who has to overcome something or live through something which endangers one's life, so to say. So, what we are talking about is often traumatic events which threaten the physical as well as the moral integrity of the subject, sometimes the life of the subject. The Holocaust was one of the contexts in which this discourse on testimonial accounts began emerging in the Western tradition. But we know that such traumatic events are everywhere. And we see a very large number of testimonial accounts from various parts of the world, whether it be in India in the context, in South Asia in the context of the partition, displacement, the history of displacement, which of course is a long and continuing history, the histories of genocidal violence, the histories of physical and sexual violence. In fact, much of the autobiographical material which we encounter in the present, outside the framework of literary production and even within the framework of literary production, let's say from newspapers or the media, a large part of it is of a testimonial nature. Even news reporting often draws on such testimonial accounts very frequently. Now, in the case of these testimonial accounts, what is important for us to notice is that the kind of relationships which we establish between a coherent subject and a coherent storytelling, the kind of things which I began with, they do not obtain. We cannot understand these accounts in terms of the framework of a coherent subject who intends, who consolidates, who gives meaning to the various events that have taken place by establishing a narrative sequence. Something else seems to speak through the narrative, upsetting it, challenging it, rendering it in crucial moments incoherent. Now, here I think much of what we have learned about this mode in India comes from Dalit autobiographies, as well as autobiographical narratives by what you may call oppressed and destitute forms of subjectivity. I mentioned Dalit autobiographies in particular because we know that there is a certain narrative of struggle and a certain narrative of achievement and progress which makes Dalit autobiographies often possible. They are also records of a struggle, records of moving forward from a situation in which the subject finds itself initially. But at the same time, we also know that some of the most insightful discussions that have been generated by the encounter with Dalit autobiographies, and also other records of Dalit experience, has been to do with suffering and to do with the experience of humiliation and destitution. Now, these situations, this is interesting to see. Sometimes the narrative structure itself may indicate one of affirmation, struggle, probably even limited achievement, which gives you an incentive to continue the struggle. But the force of the narrative may actually come from events which took place from a state or a stage of life which has been surpassed or left behind by the subject in question. Like we know that the experiences of humiliation in schools, in public places, is a recurrent trope which marks many of the kind of autobiographies I have in mind. Where does their power really come from? The power really goes beyond the narrative frame within which it is presented. And this is where it becomes important for us to look at the structure of humiliation and its relationship with the figure of the subject which is generated. Now, here, I did not wish to really elaborate it a lot, but some studies into humiliation have shown that the emotion which manifests itself strongly in humiliation is of a nature which cannot really be assumed by a subject and make it part of one's intelligible life. It has some striking similarities with the experience of shame, to the extent that you can say that one of the aims of humiliation is to forcibly produce shame in the victim. Now, in the case of shame, philosophers speak about a situation where you are placed in a field of visibility which you find improper, which you do not desire, from which you wish to disappear, from which you wish to escape. But you are unable to escape from your body, which is placed in this space, and at the same time, you are unable to inhabit the body and the space. So there are studies by the French thinker Emmanuel Levinas and following him Giorgio Agamben, which actually have some very important insights which help us understand the structure of this production of shame and the difficulties it constitutes for the subject to hold itself together. So here, once again, we are in the presence of a narrative where the narrative, the subject who speaks in the narrative is actually speaking for or representing a subject who is the witness subject, who has lived through this event and who is unable to articulate that experience because it violates the very limits of narrativity. So instead of a subject in control of narration, what we have here is a narrative which actually stands in for something which really cannot be understood in narrative terms. Now, you could say that in this sense, the speaking voice in these narratives is a witness figure, and what it bears witness to is the unspeakability of an experience. That is really what is being foregrounded there. Now, we know that there has been an interest in uh, questions of hauntedness, uh, ghostly, uh, spectral inhabitations, etc., in some of the writing by oppressed people. And this, of course, has come up in Dalit literature in India, as well as in literature written by oppressed minorities in some other parts of the world. Now, in Kerala, of course, we know that CIFN stories actually are uh, extremely powerful examples of uh, this dimension or this mode of representing difficult experiences. But what needs to be understood is that possession itself is a particular kind of experience of witnessing. The anthropologist Kalpana Ram, who worked with uh, women from the fishermen's community in Kanyakumari district, has a very interesting argument about spirit possession. And she suggests that spirit possession needs to be seen as an instance where the possessed person is housing an unhoused memory of injustice in the community. What's interesting about Ram's study is that it sees possession neither as a kind of sign of breakdown of the particular individual subject in question, nor does it see it as a kind of strategy which is adopted by the individual subject. Here, of course, the individual who is possessed is seen as having no control over whether it should be possessed or not. But that individual is opening itself to house a certain memory of an unjust death, an unnatural death, because we know that in the case of ghostly lives, we are always dealing with bad deaths where there is some kind of sense of the life being cut off before its prime and before its completion. So in this sense, possession should be seen as a sort of witnessing. And this kind of possession narratives should be understood precisely in the sense in which I spoke about testimonies, where we are no longer attributing the voice to an individual in control of its narration, but we are talking about a theater where the narration becomes just one of the props in order to manifest something more difficult. And that more difficult thing is what I would call the more important part of the historicality of what is being presented before us. Now, I was speaking about these inauspicious deaths and the question of possession. Now, this brings me to the last point I want to make in this lecture. This is to do with an increasing prominence in what we used to call life writing studies and life writing literature of death and elements related to death. You could say that there is a kind of, there are forms of death writing and inscriptions of death which have become very prominent in our public domain over the past 10 or 15 years. Now, we know that death, of course, has a relationship to all autobiographical and biographical narration, because death, in some sense, is the limit of life, and in that sense, it is seen as that point which brings the life story to a completion. I'm not speaking about death in that sense. Here, it is precisely deaths which occur where such completion is rendered impossible, that become central to death writing. Now, this has become very important in the public domain in the writing of grief, the writing of loss, writing of destitution, where you live in imminent danger of your life being annihilated. These kinds of writing possess or demand a reading which takes this relationship between death and contemporary self-articulation seriously. I began thinking about many of these things not only after working a bit on C.I. Evans' work, but also in the context of the prominence of suicides in the public domain, and suicides which can no longer be understood in terms of a personal history of an individual, but suicides which have a what you may call a political dimension, not in the sense that they are committed as self-conscious political acts, but suicides which can only be rendered intelligible against the background of a context which you have to see as political. The suicides of Dalit students in universities in India, as especially the suicide of Rohit Pamela, the suicide note, these things brought this dimension of writing and this dimension of events very, very prominently before the public domain. We also know that the farmer suicides, for instance. I have a colleague, Jomi, who is completing a PhD thesis on farmer suicide notes. What is striking about farmers' suicide notes, the very few which I saw on the internet, is its striking similarities with the language of petitioning, which I mentioned earlier. On the one hand, there is the foregrounding of a question of justice and sometimes very specific demands being made about the waiving of a loan, or sometimes even the demand that a particular figure of political authority like a minister should actually come to the place of suicide before the body is actually removed from there. And these demands, since they find the demands which they find no fulfillment in normal life, eventually are made by taking the very life of the petitioner. And you could call it a kind of desperate mode of existence of a form of political agency in conditions of despair, or a desperate existence of political life. In autobiographical writing in Malayalam, the text which really brought this very strongly to the foreground was Salina Prakanand's account of her life and the Chengra agitation. There, you know that the threat of suicide is used as a desperate political weapon of resistance in the movement. What does it mean to use this as a political weapon? Now, there is a history of people threatening self-harm before people in authority to obtain what they consider as just demands. Like in the colonial period, Radhika Singha speaks about Brahmins harming themselves before the company official's office, for instance. The idea is that there is a sacredness to one's life. There is a certain valorization of certain forms of life. And by imperiling that oneself, you are actually you are creating a certain you're endowing a certain kind of guilt and responsibility on the other person. But here we are not dealing with lives of that kind. Here, the lives which are put on the line are precisely lives which are not regarded by the state as valorized, except for the pretension or the vocal privilege given to human life in general. There is nothing special here. If anything, one may say, following Hannah Arendt and other people, that this kind of putting one's life on the line comes increasingly in the case of those people who have been rendered without recourse as a kind of superfluous population. So what is actually put on the line is not valorized life, but really destitute life. Now, we know that this kind of foregrounding of destitute life, or foregrounding of life at the threshold of death, at a certain kind of situation of imperilment, so to say, comes up in contemporary times, so it has come up in recent times, in the context of the prominence of what many thinkers have called biopolitical power and biopolitical technologies. Now, I feel that what may be happening in our times probably involves a shift in the modalities of operation of biopolitical power. We know that in its earlier formulations, biopolitical power, which is ostensibly aimed at the welfare of the entire population, comes to turn against particular sections of society who are seen as threatening the overall welfare of society. So this is a strange paradox of biopolitical power. In fact, this is a strange paradox of biopolitical. The theory of biopolitical power was generated to explain why is it that it's in the 19th and 20th centuries that you get the biggest genocides, with the paradoxical condition that these genocides are actually done in the name of the welfare of the population in general, or the nation in general. But I feel that this paradigm of this framework of biopolitical power, probably in our times, combined with the development of the accelerated development of technologies of individuated surveillance, is undergoing a change. Technologies which actually identify the individual with absolute determination. That is, not the individual as an interiorized subject, but the individual as a matrix of various parameters through which one can be located. This has become one of the key features of biopolitical power in our times. And this also has the paradoxical consequence, which we are facing now all over the world, including our own country, is the deactivation or the demobilization of spaces of coming together. That is what we call spaces of publicness, places of solidarity, places of exhibiting oneself before other people. Now, Hannah Arendt spoke about politics as the domain where human beings exhibit themselves to each other through actions and utterances. This is precisely that public domain. And the contemporary modalities of biopolitical power seem to be directed at deactivating this and permitting it with the express consent of the state selected. Now, I mention this because the power of something like humiliation, for instance, which Dalit autobiographies and autobiographies of oppressed people foregrounded. The power of that really is dependent upon our experience of publicness. In fact, it is within a space of publicness that the experience of humiliation attains its political value and attains its status as a sign of injustice. But with the extreme individuation and privatization in the sense of the opposite of publicization of life in our times, I worry whether narratives of that kind would any longer possess the political charge they possessed some time ago. How this would affect self-narration is something which I do not know about, but which I worry about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. For sharing an important talk, it is very useful to understand the present experience, personal experiences, and social memories, even though it can't reveal its act.
Aparna, could you speak louder, please? Aparna?
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, fine.
Thank you, sir, for the interesting and informative talk. Now this session is open for the discussion. I will read out the questions in the chat box. Sir,
Yes, yeah, please.
the first question is from Sudhi CJ. What are the changes that take place when there is a shift from memoir or diary writing to digital self-narratives? How can the idea be addressed in a context where suicide notes are found in digital self-narrative formats and the revolutionary Me Too movements are taking place as a powerful self-expressions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. These are really important questions. Now, see, when digital self-narratives began proliferating, let's say about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, this was seen as a very important moment in the history of autobiographical writing. Like everybody is an autobiographer in some sense. And some people also saw in it a kind of narcissistic turn of the public domain where people are posting their everyday lives a lot, etc., etc. Now, it is essentially seen as liberatory. But now we cannot look at the digital platforms and the constant invitation that we get to display ourselves there as a kind of unmitigated good. We know that these are also places of surveillance, not only by corporate entities and business enterprises, because depending on the posts I look at, I get advertisements geared to products which are linked to that. And at the same time, we also know that increasingly our social media profiles are also a matter of extreme interest to the state, not only our nation state, but also other states where we might apply for visas or things of that kind. So its publicness and its freedom of access also has become a new kind of arena of surveillance. In fact, pleasure has become one of the modes by which, or media by which surveillance is actually effected now. So this is something which is important to remember, which is why we cannot really see about it as a unmitigated expansion. Now, I would say that, you know, the suicide notes, Me Too movements, etc. I fully agree with you that these are powerful modes of self-expression, and also what characterizes the effectiveness or the newness of these political interventions is a different relationship they possess to speed or velocity. Yeah? unlike the earlier forms where things actually moved slower, now there is an instantaneous quality to these expressions, the reactions, etc., etc. And also probably the way in which we live our social lives, the temporality of our social lives and political lives has undergone a change. But we also know that the possibilities which are opened up by this increased velocity is also countered precisely by the kind of surveillance techniques that I mentioned a moment ago. So it's a complex issue which I do not know what more to say about that. Yeah, and Sudhi, yeah, one more question Sudhi has, isn't it? Yeah.
How can self-writing or narration contribute to the field of medical discourse in a post-COVID era where illness is much more than a medical reality? How can self-writing reflect upon the psychological dimension of a disease?
Actually, this is too early to say anything about it. And I must say that I hadn't thought about this uh, particular dimension that Sudhi has drawn attention to in relation to COVID. We know that, in relation to medical conditions, uh, the digital domain made possible a very high degree of solidarity and sharing of experiences. In fact, things which were earlier possible only through great difficulty became possible over the last 20 years or so. People suffering from particular illnesses, the groups where they share not only their experiences, but also the possibilities of treatment, means of addressing the psychological dimension of things. So this has been one of the very important dimensions of the virtual communities that were made possible by the internet. Not only that, because of the anonymity that is offered by our digital existence, the conditions of our digital existence, it is also possible to speak about things without really having to own them in a publicly visible manner. That the post actually belongs to you is not as a physical person that other people may know. It is not so important. But we know that in more recent times, there has also been an attempt to make make this digital domain more in tune with legal accountability by states. So there is also an attempt to track and regulate who is posting what. This may have some consequences for that. Now, in the context of COVID, of course, I haven't really looked at the digital domains where people have been sharing experiences of survival or experiences of grief. I know that I have seen actually some people who lost their dear ones posting about them on the internet. But beyond that, I haven't really systematically looked at it. But it's a very important issue, I agree, because in the case of COVID, we also know that many of it has changed the experience of death, like in the case of other pandemics, but here exacerbated by the network of visibility, the inclusiveness of systems of surveillance, etc., etc. So not only proximity and presence during when people die, during the last hours of somebody's life, but also grieving, rituals after death. All these have undergone a complete change. And uh, it is very difficult to see the new structures or the new protocols which are emerging as possessing any kind of meaning apart from the framework of sanitation and the framework of health. So this may actually have consequences for our experience of death and our experience of intimate death. But I do not really know much about the uh, sharing of experiences of survival. And that would be interesting to look at. Thank you for that question.
Sir, another question from Srinivasa Ravuyenda. What are the factors which determines the degree of truth and authenticity in a literary work? Sir?
Yeah, and I'm just reading that question once again to understand it fully. Yeah, see, this is the difficulty which we face. In fact, it's a very good question because it also makes a distinction between truth and authenticity. How do we determine the question of truth? Now, we know that this is something which plagues autobiographical writing uh, right from the beginning. Is what I am telling you the truth? And I also spoke about a kind of juridical context in which many of these autobiographies emerged in modern times or otherwise. In modern times, sometimes the juridical frame is constituted by a public where the writer is seen as defending himself or herself before a public. Now, this has given rise to the feeling that what you may be telling may not be the complete truth. But autobiographies often rely on, especially in modern times, they rely on this idea that you have a kind of access to your own life, which other people do not have. And that mindness or the first person point of view on the experience is what constitutes its authenticity. So there are autobiographers who even wrote that even though there may be mistakes in my recollection, the feelings that animate my autobiography are absolutely right. But we know that these things are far more complex. For first of all, we are aware that it is impossible to know one's desire, so to say, in the sense that what is brought forward in the autobiographical domain is animated by aspects of oneself which one cannot see. So any kind of explicit claim about truth and authenticity is really difficult to determine in relationship to the claims that people make. Now, the way in which we often, in the case of, since you asked literary work, I assume that you also have in mind other genres in work. And what you're talking about is not merely that of an empirical truthfulness, empirically verifiable truthfulness. When it comes to that, I still feel that uh, in the case of literary narratives, even in relationship to the kind of affective charge that I spoke about earlier, uh, truth probably works in terms of a certain kind of power to affect in a way which goes beyond narrative understanding. What I mean by that is uh, what we call the ring of truth. The ring of truth is not really uh, about whether all the things actually fit in together. It's about a certain tone, yeah? Certain tone, a certain uh, relationship between the speaker and what is said, which you can imagine and which you can insert yourself into. These seem to be what we often are convinced by as signs of truth. But of course, in uh, accepting them as such or in consenting to them as such, we are also shaped by uh, the desires which we do not understand. These things, of course, are not matters of individuals. They belong to a certain historical moment. And so these are some of the complex factors which determine this very, very difficult set of questions which you indicated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Sharanya Narayanan. Has self-writing taken over the form of a weapon today rather than a form to express oneself?
Yes, you're right, actually. But they are not in contradiction with each other. It was a way of expressing oneself as uh, a form to express oneself. Capturing a form itself actually can be a weapon. The difficulty which I was trying to indicate is that uh, weapons of this kind are not fully in our control. Usually, when we use the word weapon, we really think of an instrument we can use to produce particular effects. Here, the effects it may generate and the way in which it may determine us may actually go beyond that set of intentions. But in general, you are right in saying that uh, even self-expression increasingly have come to be seen as effecting some form of action. So in that sense, I would say that self-expression itself is increasingly seen under the sign of a weapon or a tool or a mode of intervening in something and effecting something.
Sir, another question from Jayaji Nair. We find social media forms being increasingly used for self-narration. What could be the problems and dimensions? What about judgment in a autobiographical or biographical writing?
Yeah, Jaya Nair's first question I already addressed when I spoke at some length about the question of the internet and social media. And so, as I showed, it is a complex thing with, on the one hand, self-expression, on the other hand, surveillance. And what about judgment in autobiographical biographical writing? Here, you remember the point I was trying to make about inhabitation, like judgment often what is put forward explicitly as judgment in autobiographical narration is really about a conscious upholding of a certain normative structure. But what the autobiography may manifest or reveal or perform uh, is not only that normative frame, but also the inability to inhabit it or the difficulty of inhabiting it. And that is not fully understandable using the paradigm of judgment. It is that complex play which I think is what is interesting about life writing texts from a historical point of view.
Sir, another question
Yes.
from E. Thomas.
Yes, please go ahead.
She is asking, as an alternative to the so-called objective explanations, where autobiographical narration becomes the center of the text. Even in a discipline like social anthropology, while with all the radical turns, autobiography is still seen as the other of objectivity, especially in places like India. What are the possibilities that you suggested to deal with the binary of objectivity, subjectivity in life narration?
Yeah, can I just take a minute? I'll read through this question once more. It's a complex one. Yeah, thank you, Renee. It's a complex question. One of the difficulties I've had with looking at uh, autobiography and historicity was precisely the subjective objective uh, divide, which seemed to animate quite a lot of analysis. And not only that, also our what we may call commonsensical thinking, like this is a subjective mode, uh, where we tend to think that the subject is actually an individual with a particular set of constraints which are sometimes understood as psychological, sometimes understood as ideological or cultural, etc., etc. And then the objective is seen as something which is free of them. But we know that the concept of subjective and objective may not really be fully accessible to this kind of distinction, where we may need to understand the subject as not necessarily an individual and not necessarily as psychological, but as something which presupposes a position, presupposes the subject as an entity for that universe to be understood. And this can, of course, be radicalized in certain ways. In fact, the set of comments I tried to make about inhabitation, about affect, etc., were in that direction, where the subjective cannot really be anchored in the way in which the subjective has come to be anchored within a framework of what one may crudely call bourgeois individualism. Now, in fact, in autobiography studies and the study of life writing, one of the disciplines which I found very useful to draw on in a very selective and limited way was anthropological literature. This is not so much on account of a more coherent or more adequate account of the, the self-narrative itself, but more in terms of its focus on practices. Yeah? So there I felt that literary studies, this is not only true about autobiography studies, it is also true about literary or textual studies in general, where I feel that a focus on practices within which the text may be generated and within which it may be used, that might actually be a very useful framework to move away from an analysis of representations, which continues to be dominant in quite a lot of literary critical work, where we tend to understand the structure of representations and the universe it belongs to in terms of be it an ideology or a discursive structure, etc., etc. In other words, the focus remains on meaning, whereas the text may not be so much about meaning, it may be about being part of a set of practices. So I know that this does not really respond to your question, but because also I do not really know about the anthropological literature which you refer to. But this is, I'm afraid, what I can offer by way of response. Thank you.
Another question from Sharanya Narayanan. How does the autobiography of men and women differ?
This is a difficult question, Sharanya, just as it is difficult to answer the question who is a man and who is a woman, in the sense that uh, we know that the really important and interesting, challenging autobiographical narratives really come where gender identities are not merely affirmed or taken as given, but where the autobiographical presentation itself seems to be doing something to it. See, earlier there were some attempts to distinguish men's autobiographies and women's autobiographies in terms of features. Yeah, and but such distinctions there, which are valid in themselves, should be seen as a comment on the conditions of autobiographical production and what different kinds of subjects attempted to do being located where they are. So, insofar as they help us understand something, it is not about a essential distinction between men's and women's autobiographies or between men and women, but rather between what is a woman's subject of autobiographical narration in a particular kind of context. What does that voice seek to draw on as resources? What kind of effects does it hope to achieve? And how do these differ from the things adopted by a male subject? But we know that many of those distinctions which were made at that time are no longer seen as valid because these forms themselves have dramatically changed. What would be interesting would be to see how these autobiographies can be taken as a starting point for understanding the location within which the speaking voice finds itself and what it tries to do from there in the case of autobiographies by men and women. That would be the kind of approach that I would recommend in relation to this question.
Sir, another question from Sandhya Deveshan Nambyar. How do you frame the relationship between suicide and notions of non-violence, especially as a form of political action, as in the instances of self-immolation by Tibetan monks as protest against territorial occupation? Also, the larger relationship with ongoing genocides or forms of the necropolitical issuing within nations and societies.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. These are really the questions which we need to understand more fully, and I feel that these are some of the compelling questions. And in many languages, there is a distinction between two ideas of life. Like in the word life in English, in Malayalam, we translate it at least by two different words. One is the word jividam, and the other is jivan. Yeah? And we use the word jividam to refer to a narrativizable entity, which is temporally extensive over a period of time. So you could say that biography and autobiography, in some sense, occupy that space of narration of Jivita. Jivan, on the other hand, is seen as a non-narrative object. It cannot really be the object of a narration because it is actually referring to the principle which differentiates the living from the dead or the living from the non-living. And it does not seem to have this kind of temporal dimension. It may even not have a direct relationship to a meaning which opens itself to narration. Now, the relationship between suicide and non-violence, which you bring up, this question, I think, belongs to the distinction which I'm trying to make, because there is an understanding of violence in relationship to this temporal extensity, which is also the space from which our historical life begins. Violence which is seen in terms of justness, unjustness, etc., etc. But some of those may appear different if we look at the question of Jivan itself. We know that in the case of suicides, many people try to argue that there is violence involved in the idea of suicide, in the sense that it actually cuts life, whether it be one's own life. And in that sense, it challenges the principle of the sacredness or preciousness of life itself. But I'm not sure about this. It may also be a kind of, I feel that it will be difficult to differentiate this act from a position of an affirmation, which also refuses life to be accommodated in frames which it sees as contrary to the life's energies. So these issues have, of course, become very, very important in the context of necropolitical technologies. And what I spoke about a little bit towards the end in terms of the extreme individuation and disabling of publicness and solidarities, which seem to have become an aspect of the contemporary biopolitical regime. That changes the meaning of solitude, it changes the meaning of loneliness, and it changes our relationship to the relationship which can obtain between solitude and affirmation. And I feel that the question of suicide probably needs to be rethought in the light of these difficult questions. Thank you.
Another question from Aditya Pradhaban. Narration is always subjective, especially suicide notes. How a witness or narrator can historicize it objectively.
Yeah, see, my point is that it's very difficult to hold on to the subjective objective opposition in that psychologizing sense. And I think the question of historicizing is important. That I think is the challenge that historians will face. Like what is, more than the word historicizing, what does this event tell us about uh, the historicality of the event? Now, that does not mean that we can place the event in a remarkable historical epoch. We can understand it in terms of some kind of historical processes of evolution. That may be only one dimension of it. But there may also be something which resists that, something which is of the character of an event, which disrupts the historical frames of intelligibility or the narrative frames of intelligibility. Now, the challenge for a historian who is interested in the particular mode in which literature or texts of self-articulation demonstrate their historical belonging. One of the points with which I began, where literature does not become an object, but it becomes one of the modes of articulating historical existence. The challenge for the historian is actually to evolve methods which does not submit to an understanding which is solely based on narrative interpretation, where the narrative actually breaks down, where it is rendered impossible, where there are problems of inhabitation. This is precisely where one may need to understand oppose this question of historicality.
Next question from Meera Velai then. How do we look at silence towards certain narratives?
Yeah, see, this is again interesting, that these silences are also difficult to interpret because sometimes you feel that the silence either means marginalizing something or seeing something as not capturing the public attention. Now, this can be true because we know that especially in the public domain, there are certain things which become more visible and certain things which people find it easier to talk about, easier to read, and certain things which speak to you more easily. But it may also indicate a discomfort. Like sometimes a narrative may actually make your own kind of the space from which you read narratives less secure. It may endanger it, it may pose a threat to that. And this threat may actually not be recognized consciously by us. It may manifest itself in a certain indifference, in a certain inaudibility. We may not actually hear what the text is saying. We may not want to hear it because if we hear it, then of course we may need to reorient ourselves dramatically. Now, such texts sometimes come back, like the silence towards a certain narrative at a particular moment may not really decide the destiny of that narrative. There may be a different moment where a society or a culture or a public may find in that text some of the questions which it wants to ask and which it is unable to ask. And earlier, when the text appeared and when it offered that possibility, they were not able to even see that. But a time may occur when this may change. But there is no guarantee about this.
Sir?
Yes.
Another, it's a long note from Dilip Raj.
Yes.
While looking at the writings drawing on autobiographical and fictional texts, including that of Udayan's what I feel is that such writings themselves are becoming more creative and imaginative than objective and rational. Is it because such artistic documents are more reliable and thick material containing lived experiences of a period? Would you agree with Sundar Sarukai's contention that we should look at autobiographies and fiction based on lived experiences as legitimate mode of theories? Sanil Mohan also argues that through rendering of the past, the borderline between fiction and fact ceases to exist, and an alternate rendering of listening is made possible. In short, do you think that fiction and autobiography has the potential to capture phenomenology of humiliation?
Yeah. Thank you,
In,
Dilip. This is again, see, in general, I am in agreement with what you're suggesting. Uh, you know, one thing I would like to add in relationship to what uh, Sundar is suggesting in that argument which you cited. Uh, I'm saying this as somebody who is a student of these texts. For me, the challenge is actually uh, to identify that particular mode of thinking. Uh, I would use the word thinking more than theorizing, because Sundar and Gopal, of course, they make those arguments in a particular context about theory. But the real challenge is how do we delineate, how do we understand the particular mode of thinking which has taken the form of these texts. Yeah. In other words, how can we read these texts as modes of thought? This is really the question. And I feel that challenge can be addressed only by uh, devising new or more adequate uh, ways of listening and tools for articulating uh, that experience of listening. So what I presented here is really an attempt to probe towards that. And that, I think, continues to be the challenge, an important challenge in academic scholarship on literary texts, life writing, etc., etc. And I feel that there is some, therefore, this has important consequences for the way in which we write history and the way in which we use these texts for a historical understanding.
sir, next question
Yes.
from Haridas Bibi.
Yeah.
Can we found the life of the loser from the winner's accounts?
Yeah. Uh, what we call the survivors' accounts in the context of testimony are really you cannot really call them winners' accounts. In fact, uh, what the kind of texts I was indicating were really written by people who were victims, and they survived, but survival does not really mean winning. There must be winners' accounts as well. Like in a general sense, you speak about history is actually the winner's account. Uh, the tiger were to tell the story, it would be different from that. But here, uh, we are trying to look at how an experience uh, marks a subject in a certain way, where its voice is affected by that, and its voice gives body to that experience. That is a different relationship to the account of events, so to say. The account of events is the kind of framework within which the winner's account and the loser's account are often spoken about. But in the case of testimonies, it is not only the question of the account, it is also the question of a, what you may call a certain kind of X-ray of the subject. How does history in the form of this event work on the subject? And the testimony is seen as giving us some kind of entry point into that.
We look at suicide notes suggested an underlying pattern which is common to all of them, which is the presumption that this private note would soon become a part of the larger public domain where it will be inevitably scrutinized. Doesn't this suggest that fact in a sense it becomes a punctured kind of self-expression where the writer makes a conscious choice about what to include or exclude depending upon how he or she wants it to be read, thus stripping it of its reliability to some extent?
Yeah, see, this is one of the ways in which we can approach suicide notes, and because the writer of the suicide note can be seen as exercising a conscious agency in trying to shape how he or she will be perceived, after death. This is entirely possible. But what I'm trying to suggest is that this kind of uh, reading based on a skeptical epistemology, which is really what we are trained as academics to employ on any kind of document that we come across, does not really account for the kind of address of something like the suicide note as it is received uh, by the survivors, by the people who are left in the world, because uh, the dead person does not uh, does in a domain which is unaffected by those responses. Yeah, it is the living who have to live with the event of the suicide and the suicide note. So there, our methods of skeptical epistemology may actually not allow us to go to the force of something like the suicide note that we have to reckon with. So the challenge is actually to see what would be the tools for understanding that address, to look at that address closely and see how our own permeability to the note is actually shaped by this. These are the, like in the case of Dilip's question, these are the search of new tools that I'm trying to indicate, because if we continue to practice that skeptical epistemology, we can of course eliminate this entire domain of new issues which are being brought to us.
Another question from Sharanya Narayanan. Is there the bargaining of the conscience in self-narrative when compared to other literary genres where thoughts are given when with full freedom?
Yeah, Sharanya, I don't think it is true about other forms, and because I don't think there are genres which give full freedom. What exactly are we really regarding as full freedom? Because any articulation is working with a set of constraints and shaping uh, what we understand as uh, expression, what we understand is corresponding to what we want to say. And freedom is something which, a certain relationship which is adopted with those constraints. And they exist both in life narratives as well as literary narratives. The difference between them may pertain more clearly uh, to our relationship with the public if we are uh, if we are conscious about it. Like there are people who would rather write fiction rather than write an autobiography to speak about their lives. Now, this is not really so much about freedom as much as seeking a certain protection of fictionality, which you think will be more enabling for you. But this may not be true about other people. There are people who, even in literature, want to approximate to an autobiographical voice. So this situation, of course, varies.
Thank you, sir,
Yeah, thank
for
you
the
so much.
interesting and informative talk. It is very useful to understand the personal experiences and social memories, even though it can't reveal its accurate form, even in the self-writing works. And also, sir, you explained us on how certain memories and events strategically making possession and space in the narrative discourse. I hope that we don't have further questions. Thank you so much for your insightful answers, sir. So
Thank you,
let's wind up
Aparna.
this session with vote of thanks. I invite Akhil, research scholar, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Aparna. Good evening to all. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, its entire fraternity and organizing committee, I feel immense pleasure to take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to our eminent scholar, Dr. Udaya Kumar, who delivered a wonderful lecture on self-writing, narration and sense of the past. Thank you, sir, for your insightful lecture.
Thank you, Akhil. Thank you, Shiba, and everybody. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank all those who participated in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Udaya. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Shiba. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope it was clear. Thank you.
Yes, yes, it was indeed.